This was absolutely the most outrageous flight in history. An elderly passenger suddenly suffered a heart attack on the plane. The flight attendant frantically asked if there was a doctor on board. Upon hearing this, Jack uncontrollably stood up. Under the admiring gazes of fellow passengers, Jack displayed a strange expression, as if harboring an enormous secret. It turned out Jack's real job was as a chef. Despite studying medicine for 10 years on his own, he had never passed the medical licensing exam. Looking at the patient's medical records, Jack could only lie and claim that surgery was impossible without an anesthesiologist and nurse to assist. But then the unexpected happened. Following the flight attendant's inquiry, an anesthesiologist and nurse quickly stepped forward. However, this anesthesiologist was actually a novelist. Anesthesiologist was merely his pen name. When he heard the flight attendant call for an anesthesiologist, he instinctively stood up. Even more surprisingly, the nurse standing before them was also fake. She just happened to be wearing a nurse's uniform for her job at a bar. At this point, all three began consoling themselves, grateful that at least the other two were professionals. As everyone began pressuring them to perform surgery, Jack nervously claimed the plane lacked proper medical equipment and they needed to make an emergency landing immediately. Just then, Mike suddenly stood up and grabbed a knife to hijack the flight attendant. However, Mike's knife was actually an airplane model, and his true identity wasn't that of a hijacker either. He was just an office worker who had been pulling overtime for an entire year, finally getting 3 days off. He didn't want his vacation plans disrupted, so he decided to pose as a hijacker. But the flight attendant wasn't real either. His actual identity was that of a crime boss. The real flight attendant rushed to inform the captain of the situation, only to discover that the captain was fake too. Deshawn had given the Real captain expired coffee, causing him to pass out right after takeoff. To avoid being discovered, Deshawn had to impersonate the captain. As the patient's condition continued to deteriorate, Jack was forced to begin preparing for surgery. He looked at the clock and announced to everyone, "The time is now 1:30 p.m. Surgery officially begins." However, even the clock before them was fake. It was actually the airplane's thermometer.